Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here and to be able to discuss this exciting topic. So I came into service design from, as you might have guessed, from let's say human-computer interaction and interaction design background, so to say. I have been focusing a lot on design research, and I have been practicing that internationally. So this talk today is basically some thoughts and reflections on how we can do remote research given the current challenges. So this is based on some previous work that I have done with remote research techniques, but also in some recent experiments from the last couple of months when we are all in lockdown. So one of my biggest focus of my practice is actually to figure out what are the right methods, that we can have in order to get good insights that can help us inform the design process. So this is basically the angle where I'm coming from. And recently, I have been looking online, let's say, to see what is the current status, let's say, of design research. And I have seen that most of the conversations about remote research at least focus on tools and logistics, meaning, what are the best tools for remote interviews, how to best prepare for one, what sort of to access to participants needs and so on. So there has been a lot of a body of knowledge growing online on tools and practicalities, so to say. So whoever wants to kind of grow in this area, there is a lot of resources. However, this conversation and this topic is not really about tools, it's more about the methods and practice. So can we actually make this work really well for us? So if we look at, let's say, service design, and our core research is focused on understanding people, their needs, and understanding people's behavior. So to some extent, being able, looking at, let's say, what we used to do, field work, sort of face-to-face visits and so on, is not something that we can just directly translate and replace online just by saying, substituting let's say the face-to-face contextual interview with an online, because we can't really observe behavior. We're missing a lot of the context, and we're missing those impromptu conversations that happen when we just see something in the environment of the people that we visit in their homes or in their workspaces. So I'm looking at some of these pictures from past field trips with a certain level, a certain feeling of nostalgia, so to say. However, we need to adapt our practice. And for that, I wanted to introduce this as a metaphor for adaptation. What you see here might be familiar to those of you who live in London. It's a fox. And although it's a wild animal, it has perfectly adapted to living in an urban environment. It has managed to survive, and it by now has become a normal sight to a lot of people. So how can we adapt to an environment of constraints, and how can we overcome some of the limitations that we have in doing research online? So here are a few thoughts on how to do that based on my experience. So one of the key challenges that we have is that online interviews are somewhat prone to a heavy cognitive load. So just put yourselves in the place of your participants and think about the many things that they have to take care of. Let's say during an online interview, for example, they have to make sure everything works correctly. They have to pay attention to you and your questions. If you're sharing something, that's an additional kind of level of information. To some extent, it's what we normally observe is that it's quite often that they miss some important detail that you're trying to get across, or on the other hand, they get distracted with some other detail. So this is sort of a challenge, like in terms of to focus attention on the conversation that you want to have. And one of the things that I have found very useful in order to address this challenge is storytelling. So basically, I have also been using storyboards and service scenarios, let's say also offline and online. And especially the advantage that they bring in an online environment is that you don't have distractions of user interfaces or details. The conversation can be about the story and about the problem that is being represented or about the solution. So depending on what your project is about, you can think about stories that are discussing a particular product problem or a situation if you want to explore that further um, with your participants. Or you can think about a whole kind of scenario in which you present the problem to solve. What are the interactions with the service, let's so to say, and what is the result, what is the impact of the service, in order to see if this scenario resonates, if this is relevant to the way they do things in their day-to-day life, and kind of probe, go a bit deeper on particular examples in which those scenarios would make sense. Another thing that we can do in order to become, more effective online is to prepare offline. And by that, I don't mean so much what we talked about earlier, practicalities and making sure there is good access to tools and everybody has tried out things before the session, etc., but more about the content. So recently I had a challenge. I had to do some interviews over the phone. So this is, let's say, the more analog that it gets. And, I needed to kind of share some ideas about a potential new service with the customer of my client. So what I did is I emailed them, let's say, a link to the landing page beforehand, which was explaining what this was about. And then I ran the interview to gather their thoughts and feedback, simply calling them on their phone. One of the things, if you do an approach like this, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is to first check their understanding of the material, if they actually had a look at it and what they understood, because you may need to continue with some additional explanations of, in order to make sure that they have the information that you need in order to have the conversation you have to have. Another big challenge that we have online is about building rapport and kind of connecting with participants. It's much harder than, let's say, in a face-to-face context. And to some extent, and possibly also because of what I mentioned earlier about the cognitive overload and a certain sort of sense of distance, we lose sometimes depth. So I had a case when I ran a study where some interviews were face-to-face and some were actually done online, and I noticed that the online interviews were somewhat shorter than the face-to-face one. Maybe they were also a little bit to the point, but in this case, we also want to explore and to go a bit further with those interviews. So we need to be mindful of this sort of, let's say, connection or difficulty in kind of establishing connection, so to say, and work around it. So a few things that we can think about is obviously small talk. Actually, humor, is quite important to create this kind of connection. Being very responsive, giving lots of facial expression feedback, but in an authentic way. And also another thing to consider is that maybe it's not all about asking questions and getting answers. It's also about showing maybe a sketch or ask them to do a very simple activity, like show them a set of cards and ask them to choose the one they are mostly interested in. So, to kind of vary, let's say, this stimulation and keep the conversation interesting and engaging. If we're thinking about group interviews, let's say, or co-creation workshop, for example, icebreakers are quite important also for participants to be able to connect to each other in this particular context. And I'm going to get to this in the next point. And we will hear a bit more about co-creation sessions later on. And the truth is, I don't know if you have participated in any of those recently, like in any online ideation, so to say. They tend to be quite productive. And a lot of the ideas can be generated in a very short amount of time. Now, if we look at it from the point of view of research, of participatory design, one disadvantage is that we're missing, let's say, we're slowly losing the individual perspective of needs and motivation within the group dynamics online. So this is something that we need to work for. So a little example I can give you here is a few weeks ago, my students in service design, a group of master students, tried a co-creation experiment online with a group of international participants who didn't know each other. They were quite successful also in terms of engaging people and having a nice warm-up activity where people had to share, let's say, the way that they address stress and what helps them relax and what helps them um, kind of like disconnect during times of stress like we currently experience. And they also put a lot of great skills on ideation in practice during those sessions. But what I felt is that, out of all these ideas, like the prioritization and so on, we sort of missed what was each participant's motivations behind their ideas, what was the underlying need. So as facilitators, we need to be more careful than ever of the loudest voice in the room. We need to sort of probe people to reflect on what they're contributing. And we can consider a completely different alternative of basically incorporating co-creation as part of an individual interview if we want to go into more depth. So we talked about adaptation. Now, can we, in this climate where we're trying to adapt to the current challenges, can we also think about what would happen beyond the current challenges in a way? Can we move from adaptation to innovation? Can we turn those challenges into opportunities to create new research methods, if you like? So for this metaphor, for this area, I want to use the metaphor of a marine iguana, which is a very special species in a sense that it only lives on the Galapagos Islands. It has evolved so it can swim in the sea and it feeds on algae, and it has perfectly adapted to its harsh environment. It has become a master of its challenging environment, and this is the metaphor that I want us to think about, because it's different from any other iguanas in the world. So maybe we can come up with research methods that are different from anything else that we have been doing before. So here is a couple of ideas or thoughts, let's say, that might point to this direction. One idea is about how we could combine better offline and online. Like we talked about individual and group activity, but what people could do also in their own time to get, let's say, a more rich perspective from remote research. So everybody has pen and paper at home, and maybe we can leverage that. So a little experiment again that I did with my master students was to run an exercise of crazy eights online. Basically, they did it offline on paper, and then everybody sketched out their ideas and shared them on the web camera. Now, if you're not familiar with this technique, it's used very much in design sprints. So the idea is that you have a design challenge and you have to sketch out 8 crazy ideas in 8 minutes. So you see some of the results of those here. So it's a good way of sort of switching between, let's say, an analytical way of thinking, analyzing the problem, into sort of coming up with solutions that may not be so obvious by liberating this kind of creativity. So we can think about, and this is an individual exercise, so we can think about something like this, how it would work in a context of, let's say, of a research project where people kind of take some time to sketch things out or to create a mind map of some sort, or to respond to an exercise that you have given them on paper, and then they either explain it to you later on when they're back online, or they can even just send it to the facilitator and have a conversation afterwards. Now, I wanted to talk to briefly touch on mobile ethnography. It is not really, let's say, something new. It has been existing for quite a while, and there are lots of good tools there out there that help us do that. Um, what the advantage of mobile ethnography is that it helps us get a glimpse into people's everyday life that we can't get simply through an hour and a half or 2 hour interview at their place. So, for example, imagine that you're doing a research in eating habits and you want to kind of promote healthy eating. One of the let's say one of the things that you may be doing would be asking people using mobile, mobile diaries to sort of asking people about their habits, what they cooked for dinner today, what's in the fridge, what are the ingredients that they're shopping, and so on. Um, so this is something that we have been doing, and it's a great additional tool to give us insights into the fabric of everyday life that we may not be able to get through a set of an interview. Now, sometimes diary studies tend to be a bit self-reporting to some extent, and at the end, they are diary studies. So my question is here, what if diary studies were a bit more conversational and less diary-like? So we can think about, instead of WhatsApp diaries, we can think about WhatsApp conversation, or if you want, WhatsApp interviews. Um, so here, we can move beyond questions and answer. We can think about having a conversation that is asynchronous but happens over a longer period of time, when people can actually do it, respond to questions at their own kind of convenient, time and space. They can think about the questions, reflect a little bit more, and so on. They can also share media, pictures and videos and so on. And this can also be combined quite nicely with the paper-based exercises, like the one I kind of gave you as an example earlier, which could be a conversation trigger, or it could be an evolving co-creation process, and so on. So a different sort of level of engagement. So what I see, like as a kind of a vision of how remote research could evolve into something new in the future, is combining some of these techniques together. So, creating some space for offline individual reflection and creativity, having the right moments to connect online and have a real-time conversation around those thoughts and ideas, and be able to co-create in real time with other people, and also have this sort of asynchronous kind of interview and sharing connection with participants that happens over time and during their everyday life, and it can be combined with a more, with the other techniques in a nice way. So this is somehow the directions where I see these different tools coming together. So just to summarize here, we talked about adaptation and London foxes, and innovation, and how we can evolve to be more like marine iguanas. What I would like to do here is just to kind of take a moment to reflect about what we have seen and what we have experienced in the last couple of months, and how much innovation has actually happened out there. So I will give you one last example. I have recently a client project where my client wanted to have some online interviews with their customers in order to understand what kind of data insights they're interested in order to create, let's say, a new dashboard experience, so to say, without going to too much detail. So the project started by talking about interviews and questions and what we want to find out and so on. And eventually it has evolved into a co-creative exercise where we have a set of small cards that are, each one of them communicates a a data analytic insights and insight and actionable insight that they can work with. And then they can just look at those cards and reflect. The cards are quite high level. To some extent, you can even say they're abstract, but each one communicates, let's say, a piece of information. And then the idea is to sort of drag and drop those cards into a space to create to prioritize and to create, let's say, their ideal dashboard experience. So, this is kind of like how fast we can innovate. And, of course, it's an iterative process, but I'm pretty sure we will see more and more innovation in this space in the future. So these are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you today on adapting and innovating in online research. I'm planning to write an article on Medium about this topic and cover some of these areas. So if you're interested, I would love to connect, and I would love to talk more about this topic. And please let me know if you have questions.
All right, thank you, Yanna. That was super interesting. I think we have actually some questions already on Padlet appearing. Would you like Katie to read them out before?
Yes, we do. We've got a couple on there for Yanna. So the first one was, have you identified any cultural differences when it comes to how people respond to cognitive overload or the lack of depth in an online interview?
That is a very good question. I think more than cultural, there may be linguistic as well. If the interviews are in English and English is not the first language and so on. Now that I'm thinking about, there are cultural differences in terms of doing interviews in Spanish. They generally tend to be longer, but I would say I don't see the difference so much in online versus offline. I see more as in a difference of like the communication, the sort of the pattern of explaining, going into more depth and into more detail is something that may be more cultural in this case.
Excellent. I mean, I wrote down about 2 or 3 pages of notes there. It was fantastic listening to you. And I was resonating very much about how the engagement levels and how people can interact with the different platforms. And one of the other questions was, have you found it confusing, or can it be confusing to switch between offline and online activities during a co-creative activity?
I think it needs more time estimation than you might expect. So in a sense, if you run let's say co-creative Crazy 8 activity face to face, and that takes 10 minutes with a bit of briefing, and then at the moment it finishes, we estimate maybe 20 to half an hour, just to make sure that everybody is kind of like starting and finishing at the same time. However, what I haven't tried and I really want to try is to actually have a more of a pure offline activity. What I mean is more like, okay, here is a task, and let's connect again in an hour or 30 minutes or this afternoon, to kind of give people space, and so that they can actually do it while they're at home, when maybe they have to do other things and so on, and then eventually take care of the children, and eventually when they come back they've had enough time to do that. So this is an experiment that is still to be done.
I think that, I think a lot of us are experimenting with timing, but yet very useful information. Thank you very much. The other question that's on there is actually from me. So you said about WhatsApp interviews and answering questions on WhatsApp. What are the ethical considerations that you would maybe highlight for using something like that?
I think the ethical considerations are important in terms of they're as important as when working, let's say, with vulnerable communities, or with kind of sensitive data and so on, because it's a more personal connection. So you get more. You may get more insights, but of course people may sort of become more emotionally attached to the researcher, if they get very much involved. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind, especially if we're dealing with, let's say, a sensitive topic of some sorts, or if if it's a very intense conversation and it starts getting into diverging into other topics that are not part of the research. So these are some things that we definitely have to be aware of.
And I think that leads very nicely on to another question that's coming in here. In terms of that mobile ethnography, is there any sort of framework that you use to synthesize the insights and the findings that you get?
I mean, I use, what do you exactly mean by framework? Which kind of framework?
Well, I don't know. It was a question that's come from the audience. I'm suspecting some
All
kind
right.
of sort of process or system that you would follow to gather those insights from mobile ethnography.
I do have a process. I mean, it's more. I think there are different frameworks out there, but you know, like in this case, my kind of theoretical reference is missing me right now. Right now, but in terms of the practical approach, it is about kind of looking at understanding, let's say, patterns and behavioral patterns that can be, for example, a driver or a barrier for the adoption of a particular solution. So that is kind of like one, let's call it framework, that we're looking into drivers, behavior drivers or behavior barriers and constraints, and trying to understand those. And then I mean, in terms of design research, when we look into that context, the insights are quite rich, and what it does, it helps us visualize how a specific solution might or might not work, and in that particular context for the target audience that we have researched.
Excellent, Yanna. And actually that's led very nicely on to saying that the Padlet board will remain open. So if you wanted to go back on there and put your theory link, you can answer that question after, Yanna.
Thank you.